So, Ollie, it's anti-bullying week. And we know all about bullies, don't we? Because we wrote about them in the book, about a story, because you know how to deal with them. But we don't call them bullies, do we? We call them Hunter Jacks. Should we read about Hunter Jacks? I think we should. The next day, as the children arrived at the library, Mrs. Serenity smiled and said, "How did you sleep, young Ollie? Did those monsters under the bed bother you? They don't anymore, do they? Because you know what to do about those. So you've got superpowers." "What monsters?" asked Ollie, not sure what Mrs. Serenity was talking about. Molly and Mrs. Serenity smiled. "Come along, children. I hope you've had your tea. This is going to be exhausting. Today you battled the Hunter Jacks." Woohoo! Woohoo! I know, but you win. Don't worry, it's fine. Okay. Ollie and Molly gulped. Can you gulp? Yeah. "What's a Hunter Jack?" the children asked. "Well," said Mrs. Serenity, "it's a name we give to the bad part of a person that turns them into a bully." Yeah. "I hate bullies," said Ollie, remembering George and Simon. "No one likes them very much," said Mrs. Serenity, "but most of them are actually really nice until a Hunter Jack gets in their head or heart. So today I'll teach you how to stop a Hunter Jack in his path." That'd be useful, wouldn't it? Ollie and Molly followed Mrs. Serenity through the library, past lots of shelves and boxes and little magical doors. Finally, they stopped in front of a little door with the word "Caution" written on it in big red letters. The door had 6 padlocks on it. "I know, I wonder what's in there." "Scary. Don't worry, you win." "Whoa," said Molly. "What's in there that you don't want to escape?" "Hunter Jack," said Mrs. Serenity. "If they get out, they can get into everybody's head and heart. They start off in one person, then jump into another and another, turning everyone they touch into bullies. Well, if you don't know how to deal with them, they can, but we know how to deal with them." She went to open the door. "Hang on," said Ollie, his scared superpower pulling him back from the door. "We can't go in there. We don't know how to deal with Hunter Jacks yet, and I don't want them in my head or my heart." "Well, you wouldn't, would you?" "No." "But you have your magic circle," said Mrs. Serenity. "You should be okay." "Do you remember what your magic circle was, Ollie?" "It's where you stand in the middle and you think about all the superpowers that will keep you safe. So brave and calm. And then Hunter Jacks and bullies can't get in your head and your heart, and then they can't hurt you. Remember?" "Should be," said Ollie and Molly together. "No, thank you. Can't you teach us before we go in?" Mrs. Serenity looked a little annoyed, but said, "Oh, very well. Come with me." She led them up a flight of old stairs into a little room with a big glass window. Through the window, the children could see below them an empty room, very much like the other rooms that they'd had their lessons in, old and with a stone floor and fire torches. "Wait here," said Mrs. Serenity, "and watch." It's a bit scary sometimes, but Mrs. Serenity's really nice. As she left the room, and a few minutes later the children could see her in the big room below. As they watched, a little door opened, and in shuffled 6 little superpowers that usually help the librarian stack and file all the learning in the boxes. They looked very worried and stood very close together. "Don't worry," said Mrs. Serenity to the little superpowers. "I just want you to show Ollie and Molly what Hunter Jacks look like and what they're capable of. I'll put it right at the end." The little superpowers looked really worried now. "Children," said Mrs. Serenity, "can you see and hear all right from up there?" The children shouted back, "Yes." Just then, an ugly, 2-headed creature that looked like a boy but had long arms that dragged on the floor and an ugly face that just looked mean entered the room with Mrs. Serenity. It had a tail like a snake, and it's surrounded by dark grey smoke that felt cold and scary, even from the safety behind the glass in the room. "Do, do, 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 do," Hunter Jack. The little superpowers looked very worried now. The Hunter Jack hissed and licked its lips as it began to move towards Mrs. Serenity. In that instant, Mrs. Serenity clicked her fingers and her magic circle appeared around her. The Hunter Jack hissed loudly and it got angry and angrier. Suddenly it threw a ball of black smoke at Mrs. Serenity. The smoke felt cold and lonely and scary, but as it hit a magic circle, it changed into a pink cloud, which felt warm and safe, and then it vanished with a soft pink poof. The hunter jack. Sorry, back in the room. The hunter jack hissed loudly. It threw another ball, but again, when it hit Mrs. Serenity's circle, it turned from black to pink and vanished. This made the hunter jack really angry. This time, instead of throwing a ball of colour, it threw a paper aeroplane, but one with spikes and thorns on it and nasty bad words. As it rushed towards Mrs. Serenity, the words on it came to life, and Ollie and Molly could hear the two heads of the hunter jack calling Mrs. Serenity some really bad names and being very cruel. Their voices were scary and deep like a wicked witch. But as the words hit Mrs. Serenity's magic circle, the voices turned into the voice of a cartoon character, speeded up so much they sounded like they were talking really fast, and that's made Mrs. Serenity laugh. And as she laughed, the bad words vanished. That's quite funny, isn't it? If somebody says something horrible to you like, "You're stupid, Ollie," all you need to do is go, "Well, you're really stupid, Ollie. You're really stupid, Ollie. You're really stupid, Ollie." Not so powerful then, are they? Yeah. Now the hunter jack was super angry and began to get bigger and bigger. It clenched its fist and ran full speed at Mrs. Serenity. Oh no! The children could barely look. Mrs. Serenity touched her heart, and as the hunter jack got near, it began to shrink and shrink until it was as small as an ant, and the children could barely see it as it scuttled away into a dark corner. Even though it was really small, the children could see it was super angry now. Everything went quiet and still. A dark shadow began to creep towards the little superpowers, who were huddling together, shaking. Ooh, poor superpowers. The shape got bigger and darker until the children could not see the superpowers. Then they heard a horrible, scary laugh. Ha 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 ha. It was scarier than that, Ollie. Okay. The shadow disappeared, and there stood the hunter jack. But with not just 2 heads, but 8 heads. I know! It had the 6 heads of the superpowers attached, as well as their arms and legs. It was horrible and huge. The little superpowers began to hiss. They had turned into part of the hunter jack and got all of its nastiness. As the children watched, the hunter jack grew and grew and began to slither towards Mrs. Serenity. "She'll be okay," said Molly, not really believing it. "She's got our magic circle. No bad words can get in her head and her heart through our magic circle." Both children were a bit scared now. The hunter jack stopped in front of Mrs. Serenity, and again it threw a dark ball of smoke. But this time it threw a paper aeroplane covered in scary spikes and thorns at the same time. As the aeroplane left its slimy, scaly hands, it began to run at Mrs. Serenity, its fists clenched. "It's okay," said Molly, trying to reassure Ollie, who was very scared and only watching through his fingers. "Miss Serenity has beaten it once already. She can do it again." But this time something else was happening. All the little superpowers that were now part of the big hunter jack began throwing dark smoke and aeroplanes and clenching their fists too. Mrs. Serenity battled bravely, changing the birds' bad words into funny voices, turning the dark smoke into a pink colour and shrinking the hunter jack. But with the superpowers helping the hunter jack, Mrs. Serenity was losing her strength. Ollie and Molly watched in horror as Mrs. Serenity's magic circle began to flicker and fade. "Quick!" yelled Molly. "We have to help her!" Molly flew out of the room and down the stairs. Ollie didn't want to go, but he couldn't leave Mrs. Serenity to battle alone or let Molly try and beat the hunter jack on her own. Both children rushed into the room and activated their magic circles. They stood in front of Mrs. Serenity, and as the hunter jack's spells hit their circles, they bounced off and disappeared. "I'll deal with the aeroplane," said Ollie. "You deal with the smoke bombs." The room was suddenly full of squeaky cartoon voices and pink smoke. The hunter jack began to shrink, and the little superpowers began to break free and stand beside Ollie and Molly with their own magic circles to protect Mrs. Serenity. See, if loads of us get together, bullies can't hurt us, can they? The hunter jack was being beaten back and getting weaker. But with one last huge effort and a blood-curdling hiss, it charged at the children. Mrs. Serenity, now almost fully recovered, stepped forward, Swiftly she grabbed the children and moved them aside as the hunter jack ran up to her. She stepped aside and the superpowers threw themselves down in a heap. The hunter jack did not see the pile of superpowers until it was too late. The hunter jack tripped over them and over he tumbled, tumble, into the wall where he lay all dazed. Quickly, everyone, said Mrs. Serenity, ushering the children and the superpowers out of the room. She bolted the doors with all 6 bolts, and the children and Mrs. Serenity and the superpowers all collapsed on the floor. Whew, said Molly. I don't like hunter jacks. Everyone laughed, and Mrs. Serenity led them off for some biscuits and hot chocolate. That hunter jack was beating you, said Ollie. If they can beat you, we don't stand a chance. Ah, said Mrs. Serenity. It only nearly beat me when it got into the little superpowers' heads and hearts and made them join it. So it was stronger. On its own, my magic circle was enough protection. But the hunter jacks aren't very strong on their own and they're really not very brave. So what they do is get into the head and hearts and scare others so that they'll join it rather than have it pick on them. Have you ever noticed a bully has to have a little gang to feel strong? Quite sad really, isn't it? That's true, said Ollie. George was rubbish on his own, but he had Simon. The other children were afraid of him, so they didn't help me. Exactly, said Mrs. Serenity. Hunter jacks aren't very strong or brave alone, so they scare others into joining them. But if someone is being attacked by a hunter jack and their friends stand beside them, the hunter jack loses its power, said Ollie and Molly together. Exactly, said Mrs. Serenity. But I have to say, for a moment there, I thought you two were going to leave me to it. No way, said Ollie and Molly. We won't ever let a hunter jack bully someone on their own. We'll always stand next to them. That's what you do. You see, that's the thing about bullies. See, they've got superpowers like we have, but you know sometimes your superpowers get too big. Their superpower that isn't very happy gets big. Their superpower that doesn't think they're very good at stuff gets big, and that makes them angry, and then they bully other people to make themselves feel better. But if we stand together and say, I don't think so, hunter jacks, they can't hurt you because you don't let the bad words in your head or your heart.